Picture this. You're an American soldier slogging through the sweaty, suffocating jungles of Vietnam. Every step feels like Russian roulette, not because of bullets zipping by or snipers lurking in the trees. Oh no, it's worse. The ground itself is out to get you. Welcome to the Vietnam War, where even the dirt had a vendetta. So here's the million-dollar question. How did the Viet Cong turn the jungle into their own personal haunted house of horrors? And seriously, what's the deal with weaponized bamboo? Ah, the classic punji stakes. Sounds almost cute, right? Spoiler, they're not. Imagine this. You step on what looks like a harmless patch of jungle floor and bam! Your foot's been kebabbed by bamboo spikes sharper than your sergeant's wit. And it gets better, or worse. These weren't your run-of-the-mill spikes. Oh no, the Viet Cong spiced things up by coating them with poison, venom, or, brace yourself, human poop. Yep, you heard that right. Because why just hurt someone when you can ruin their whole week with an infection? These bad boys weren't just lying around. They were hidden in shallow pits, buried in camouflaged holes, and even rigged to spring out of walls in booby-trapped villages. Think you could just tiptoe your way through the jungle? Nice try. Punji stakes were the jungle's way of saying, "Not today, buddy." And then we have bouncing betties. Oh, these little monsters took landmines to the next level. Regular landmines? You step on them, they go, boom, end of story. But bouncing betties? They played dirty. Trigger one and it sprang waist high before exploding. The result? Shrapnel went everywhere, groin, abdomen, legs, you name it. These weren't just designed to kill, they were designed to terrify. A soldier hit by one didn't just drop dead, he screamed, loud and long, sending chills through his squad mates and making everyone wish they were literally anywhere else. The Viet Cong weren't just fighting a war, they were staging a psychological horror show. Meet the swinging spike trap, a medieval horror show brought to life. Picture this. You're walking through thick jungle brush when suddenly a weighted log covered in sharpened spikes swings down from the trees, impaling anything in its path. These were often triggered by nearly invisible tripwires stretched across trails. And the best part? Well, worst part for the soldiers. The Viet Cong placed these at chest or head level, making them almost impossible to survive. Now, if you think you could just stand still and be safe, wrong again, because then you might be hanging in midair, courtesy of a net trap. Step on the wrong spot and suddenly you're yanked off the ground and left dangling, completely exposed, and if you were lucky, all you had to worry about was your dignity. If you weren't, well, let's just say snipers were very good at finding easy targets. The only thing worse than knowing you were stuck was knowing you weren't getting out alive. This was everywhere. Every trail, every hut, every village. American soldiers weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the very ground they walked on. No matter how strong or well-armed they were, the jungle had one rule. One wrong step, and you're done. Traps weren't just built to maim or kill. They were built to turn soldiers into nervous wrecks, to make them hesitate to break their will before the real fight even started. And it worked. Soldiers started seeing traps everywhere. They second-guessed every step, every rustle in the bushes. Some refused to move at all, convinced death was lurking just beneath their feet. One Marine described how his unit once spent 3 hours advancing only 300 feet, not because they were being shot at, but because they were too terrified to take a wrong step. Some traps were set up as decoys, tripwires that didn't actually trigger anything. But the moment a soldier tripped one, the entire squad would freeze, sweat beading on their foreheads, waiting for a death that never came. It could take minutes before they'd realize it was fake. But by then, the damage was done. Every step after that felt like walking through a minefield. The paranoia didn't stop when the sun went down. Soldiers refused to sleep on the ground. Some were so afraid of traps being placed near their tents at night that they'd stay awake for days, running on pure adrenaline. Others reported seeing tripwires in their dreams, waking up in a panic, convinced they were about to be blown apart. This kind of constant fear had real, measurable effects. Military doctors found that by the late 1960s, cases of combat stress and psychological breakdowns had skyrocketed. Some reports estimate that 1 in 4 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam suffered from some form of psychological trauma due to the unrelenting anxiety of jungle warfare. And the scariest part? Many soldiers never stopped feeling that fear, even after they made it home. They'd avoid stepping off sidewalks, refuse to walk on grass. Some even found themselves checking their own bedrooms for tripwires. Because once you've spent months in a jungle where the ground itself wants to kill you, how do you ever trust it again? So, in a war where the enemy could be anyone and the battlefield was everywhere, who really had the advantage? In Vietnam, Two completely different styles of warfare clashed head-on. One side had the most advanced military in the world. The other had patience, terrain knowledge, and tactics that turned a technologically inferior force into a nightmare for the US Army. So, who really had the edge? Let's start with the Viet Cong. They weren't a conventional army. They were a mix of trained soldiers and local farmers who picked up rifles and fought to drive out the Americans. By 1965, they numbered over 300,000 strong, and they weren't just hiding in jungles. They were hiding in plain sight. A shopkeeper by day, a soldier by night. Their biggest strength? They were everywhere and nowhere. The jungle was their battlefield, but the underground was their kingdom. The Cu Chi tunnel stretched over 250 kilometers, deep enough to survive bombings, vast enough to house entire platoons. Some even had kitchens, hospitals, and command centers. Imagine trying to fight an enemy that could ambush you, then vanish underground within seconds. And then, you had the U.S. Army. Over 2.5 million American soldiers were deployed to Vietnam between 1964 and 1973. They came equipped with state-of-the-art M16 rifles, napalm, and B-52 bombers that could turn forests into firestorms. But here's the catch. All the firepower in the world meant nothing if you didn't know who you were fighting. The Viet Cong weren't lining up for traditional battles. They were hiding, waiting, striking, then disappearing. Every tree, every bush, every rice field could be a trap. And let's not forget the heat. The jungle turned into an oven with 49 degrees Celsius temperatures, venomous snakes, malaria, and leeches, turning every march into a survival test. American soldiers weren't just fighting the Viet Cong, they were fighting Vietnam itself. The Americans relied on firepower. The Viet Cong relied on patience. The US had helicopters, artillery, and napalm. The Viet Cong had guerrilla warfare, booby traps, and an unbreakable will to fight. One side wanted a quick victory, the other knew that time was on their side. The US entered Vietnam expecting a conventional war, a war of battles, of territory, of clear victories. But this wasn't that kind of war. The Viet Cong weren't looking to win in the traditional sense, they just needed to make sure the Americans couldn't, and they had time on their side. Vietnam wasn't just about military superiority, it was about endurance. The Americans had better weapons, but the Viet Cong had the will to outlast them. And when a war drags on long enough, soldiers stop seeing victories. They start seeing survival, they start making mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes became tragedies. Because in a war where the enemy could be anyone, and fear blurred the lines between combatants and civilians, the cost of desperation could be measured in innocent lives. March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers entered the hamlet of My Lai, believing it to be a Viet Cong stronghold. They were expecting a fight. What happened instead would stain the reputation of the U.S. military forever. For 4 hours, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment moved through the village. They found no enemy fighters, no weapons, no signs of resistance. But what they did find were unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly. And then the shooting started. By the time the guns fell silent, between 347 and 504 Vietnamese civilians lay dead. And the worst part? Many of the victims were killed at close range. This wasn't a chaotic battle. This was methodical slaughter. The man in charge of the operation was Lieutenant William Calley. He was later court-martialed, but of the 26 soldiers charged, only one, Calley himself, was convicted. His original life sentence was reduced to 3.5 years of house arrest. Justice was barely served. But in the midst of this horror, one man took a stand. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, flying a reconnaissance mission, saw what was happening below. Stunned by the carnage, he landed his chopper between American troops and the surviving villagers, ordering his crew to open fire on their own comrades if they didn't stop the massacre. He personally evacuated several wounded civilians. Thompson was labeled a traitor by some. He received death threats from fellow servicemen. But decades later, in 1998, he and his crew were finally awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest military honor for bravery outside combat. His actions saved lives, but the damage was done. The truth of My Lai was buried for over a year. It wasn't until investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the atrocity in 1969 that the world learned of the massacre. The impact was seismic. The My Lai massacre fueled anti-war protests across the U.S., shattered faith in the American military, and intensified demands to withdraw from Vietnam. It became the defining symbol of how blurred the lines between right and wrong had become in this war. War is chaos, but what happened in My Lai wasn't chaos. It was calculated cruelty, a massacre that never should have happened, and one that the U.S. government tried to bury. But history doesn't forget. The Vietnam War was a clash of ideologies, cultures, and strategies. But for the soldiers on the ground, it was a fight to survive in a world where the very earth could betray them. The traps of Vietnam weren't just tools of war. They were symbols of ingenuity, desperation, and the harsh realities of guerrilla warfare. Want more stories like this? You know what to do. Click, tap, or ignore. I don't care, but you might.
Bam. Bam, bam. Bam, bam. Bam, bam. Bam, bam.